I'm going to talk to you about a specific aspect of mediation, and I think it's quite interesting and it's quite useful because people have very different views on this, and that is the private sessions, in particularly court-annexed mediation. Now, I know that different formats of mediation, different family mediation, commercial mediation, different mediations have a different approach to private sessions. So I'm going to concentrate specifically on court-annexed mediation. And I'm going to just consider whether it is or isn't a good thing for us to use in our simple procedure cases. Now, to start, there we go. I'm going to pose two questions. Is it this? Private sessions in mediation are a gimmick used by mediators to make the mediation process easier for them. Is that what it is? Is it something that we do because it's just easier? We don't have to deal with parties who may get into a dispute, and so we go into private sessions and we feel a lot more comfortable. Or is it this? Private sessions are a useful tool in the mediator's toolbox that bring about better quality settlements. Which of the two is it? Is it something that we should be doing? Is it something that enhances the mediation process? Or is it something that we as mediators hide behind because we feel safer? Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are different views on this, not only amongst the general body of mediators out there, but in the clinic. I've mediated with some mediators who seem to prefer staying in a joint session. They seem to think that private sessions are really there for an emergency situation, for when you really have a serious problem with your mediation, but as far as possible, you should keep the parties in a joint session. Other mediators use private sessions as a standard process, as a normal part of doing their mediation. So that's what we're going to consider today. And I thought we should start with a little bit of a group discussion. I'm going to put the people on Zoom into, I think, 2 breakout rooms. How many have we got, Charlie? Did you say 7? 7 yes. People. We'll do 2 breakout rooms on Zoom, and maybe we could do, thanks, Charlie, and maybe we could do 3 groups here. I know you might have to move, but if you could just kind of regroup into 3 groups. I'm going to ask you for about 10 minutes to consider the questions on the next slide.
All right, you are. Okay. I'll tell you what.
You need to go there to get breakout rooms.
I'll tell you what, if we got rid of that, it would appear. But it's actually, you need to do your share first. So,
okay. Sorry, before we get there, I just, sorry, Charlie. I mean, everybody knows this, but what is the private session? It's a one-on-one meeting with each party before, during, or after a mediation, just in case anybody is in doubt as to actually what a private session is.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, and then we go into the group discussion, which we're going to get up on Zoom in a minute. We'll just need to show this before we go into breakout rooms, otherwise people won't see it.
I wonder, it might be fine. I'll go back to share. Sorry, Patrick, this is.
We do have a little bit of a hybrid technological problem.
No, I think we're good.
Okay, can everybody see that on Zoom? Can you see the screen? I'm going to ask you to consider these 4 points. Consider the pros and cons of private sessions. What is your preference? In what circumstances would you have a private session? And when is the best time for a private session? So if you can get into groups and discuss that, maybe here we can just form, as I say, 3 groups instead of the 4 to simplify things. And can we go into breakout rooms here? Charlie, how are we going to do that? And on Zoom, we're going to put you in 2 breakout rooms. If you can just have that discussion amongst yourselves. Okay. Can everybody join the breakout rooms? Do you have them to join on Zoom? Thanks, Charlie. Right, Roy, I think you've joined us on Zoom. Welcome. We have just had a short group discussion. You can see the content of that on the screen. Perhaps we can start here in the room and just get a bit of feedback from everybody. the three groups that we've got here, and we've got two on Zoom. Maybe we can start with the front group here. Charlie, Tom, Gordon, what are the pros of private sessions? Just give us a few pros that you've identified in private sessions.
I think each stage we feel that more to be said, but not said yet in public. Answering the local reports in the past, which slightly talking to people. How many people in the session? Gordon was saying that what types of mediation instead of spent a lot of time in mediation. Understand where they're coming from. If
I can just summarize for the people on Zoom, from the first group here, we've heard that it's a useful tool to have a pre-mediation meeting to get to know the parties, build up a bit of trust with the parties. It's good in an impasse situation when you feel that you can't really go much further in the joint session. You can put parties into breakout rooms and private sessions. And the third one, I think, Tom, you said, is when you suspect that a party wants to say something, but they don't want to say it in the joint session. Am I right? And you then can get that information from them in the breakout room where they might feel more comfortable in disclosing that information to you. Right, should we go on to Alistair's group there? Any pros that you've identified with private sessions?
And truth be told, in terms of cons, but I'll have a batch here with lots of pros.
We just want just the pros at this stage. Just the pros.
Yeah. All of them. Did you have anything?
Maybe you asked about before, during, and after.
Yeah.
Patrick. So maybe before it gives the mediator a chance to make a connection and prepare people for what lies ahead. One of the, you start that relationship building prior to the first joint meeting. I think I'm not sure whether that was mentioned by the.
For those on Zoom, John Armstrong's telling us that you have an opportunity of getting to know the parties, explaining to them what mediation is about, and building up a bit of rapport with them, essentially. Anything else from group two?
Well, I think that it's very important to distinguish between a pre-mediation discussion and the one during mediation. They're fundamentally different. As you say, the pre-mediation one, which I don't tend to do a lot of, because in the simpler cases, they're better for the more complicated cases, in my view. But the during the course of the mediation, they're absolutely essential. They are essential too, especially for reality checking. If negotiations are breaking down, if the parties appear to be totally stubborn, or their tempers are rising, there are all good reasons for having private talks. And they're absolutely essential to the trade, in my view.
That's from Alistair. I'm not sure if you heard it on Zoom. Says that there's a difference between pre-mediation meetings and private sessions during the mediation. Absolutely essential for reality checking, dealing with parties when there's a difficult situation arising, and they're an essential part of the process in the mediation. Third group over here. Any pros that you'd like to add to that?
We just thought that a pre-mediation private session allows the parties to get the issue off their chest and actually explain what their position is before the mediation party.
For those of you who couldn't hear, it allows the pre-mediation session allows parties to explain the issue, to get it off their chest, to actually say what they want to discuss at the mediation. So those are some of the pros. Let's go. Sorry, on Zoom, can we have? There were two groups. Can we have a bit of feedback from room one? I think Paul and Andrew in that room.
Yeah, we pros. The three that jumped out was one from Iona, which was helping particularly party litigants who are struggling to understand the process and struggling to understand the language that's being used.
So can everybody hear that here? Understanding the process and the language being used if parties are not familiar with the whole process.
So almost basically helping a party and translating. To echo what Alistair said, my own preference for private breakout room is because I want to speak to people about risk, and I don't want to betray their confidence in front of the other party. And another one which came from Francis, which was very good, was actually it's not just parties that need private breakout rooms, it's the mediators as well, because we want to take stock of where we are. Andrew pointed out that sometimes we have joint sessions to talk about money, but sometimes people don't want to. So that would be another good opportunity to use a private breakout room to have a conversation with the party about money and about proposals.
So to talk about something in the breakout room that a party may not necessarily want to share with the other party, but is important to the mediation.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, and room number 2. Any feedback from you? Any pros? Who's in room number 2? Adrian, I think you were.
Sorry.
Not sure who else was.
Do you want to go
I
ahead,
think
Alison?
Ben, you were there as well, I think.
The only thing I think
Was it us?
we
Yeah.
spoke about, which I haven't heard, was that it can be easier for someone to think through options sort of away from the joint session.
Thinking through options away from the joint session, you can discuss options with the parties.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
Sorry, Patrick, I had one, and I've got the same situation tomorrow with the mediation. I had one not too long ago where it turned out during the mediation that the person that was actually mediating wasn't on the claim form, and the person who was on the claim form wasn't in the room, wasn't in the mediation. So when it came to settlement, that was an interesting discussion. And then the one I've got tomorrow, it's the original respondent is being represented by 2 parties, but the respondent I don't think is going to be in the room. So pre-mediation clarification is, I found that to be quite useful, just to be clear if you've got if you've got multiple people.
Okay, so that's a private session at pre-mediation. You can use it to make sure you've got the right parties at the mediation.
Yeah.
Issues that may arise along the way. Excellent. Okay, let's quickly go through the cons. Group number 1, any cons, any problems that you foresee with private sessions?
One of the areas that we talked about was parties becoming more and more entrenched. If he says that, then I'm going to not do that. So they end up getting forward from the part because I'm not talking to them.
Sorry, can I just summarize for them? Parties becoming more entrenched in their position, says Gordon. They can get further apart from each other because they're not there to hear what each other's saying. So that's one of the cons.
Second one is that the mediator can find themselves being used as the messenger, the deliverer of bad news. And actually, that you need to be quite active in making sure that you don't end up doing that.
The mediator can become the messenger of bad news. You can be used to basically convey perhaps a bad offer or bad information to the other party where the party doesn't have to do it themselves. Great, thank you. Excellent. Next group number 2.
Something about the timing. The timing's wrong. So the media's got to really listen and observe what's going on. And if they call it at the wrong time, it could be disruptive.
Sorry, let me just summarize for those here. The timing's got to be right, otherwise it could be disruptive to the mediation. So you've got to make sure that you do your private sessions at the right time.
Yeah, and similar to Gordon's point, it could also be challenging the impartiality of the mediator.
Could be challenging the impartiality of the mediator.
Perceived as favouring, I guess, one party against the other.
Could be seen to favour the one party above the other. Right, group number 3. Any additional?
Lose the power of hearing what the other person's actually saying.
The parties lose that power.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the listener is hearing the words coming from the other party that loses a bit.
Sometimes the one party might lose the words being said by the other party, lose the context of what's being said, and that may be prejudicial to the discussion. Any other points here, Gordon?
One of the parties could leg it, and you've never seen them again.
One of the parties could leg it, and you might never see them again, which is always a danger. They could probably do that in the joint session as well, though, to be fair, if you're doing it on Zoom. Anything else from group number 3? Right, group number 1 on Zoom, Paul and Andrew, your group. Some cons of private sessions?
I think we had 2. One was from Iona, which was about people worrying, possibly feeling a bit paranoid about why is the mediator in the other room? Why has he or she been gone for so long? Are they talking about things which would be detrimental to that person? And what a mediator would need to do to try and reassure that person before they disappeared off to the other room.
So it can create a suspicion amongst one of the parties as to what's going on in the other room.
Yeah, or a worry about the mediator taking the other person's side. And I think the other one was from, Yeah, I think that was really, we didn't get on to discussing the cons terribly much, but that was one of them. I'm not sure if there were others, if anybody else in our group wants to pull in.
Anybody else in Paul's group? Right, okay, group number 2. Adrian, Ben, your group, any cons?
I don't think we had much more than the ones that have already been discussed. Can you think of anything, Alison or Ben?
Excellent.
You said losing information. So sometimes in private sessions we'll hear information that could be really useful in joint session.
Sorry, say again, Ben, you lose information.
Yeah, there's a risk of losing information that could be useful in the joint session if it's not taken back in or if it's not relayed. Yeah.
So there may be something said in a private session that the mediator doesn't get to convey back to the other party that could be important information that could have an impact on the outcome. Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you for that. Now, the next questions I think we can get through.
Can I just shout one more out? It's come to me recently. People hate being left alone.
People hate being left alone, says Charlie. They really don't like being left alone.
I know that there's a negativo, especially for somebody who's unaccompanied.
Yeah. Did you hear that? Somebody unaccompanied hate being left alone. All right. Now, the preference, and we don't need to spend time on this. Can we just, I'm going to ask people in the room here just to kind of have a show of hands. Who's in favor of the use of private sessions and who would prefer not to use them? Could we start with who enjoys private sessions, who uses them? Okay, just to give you feedback, everybody here uses private sessions. On Zoom, anybody who's against private sessions, anybody who likes to try and keep a mediation in a joint session? I can't see everybody, so just speak up if you don't agree with private sessions. Right, it seems everybody is in favor. That's excellent. And in what
Could I qualify that, Patrick? Just,
yes.
what is your preference? It doesn't matter for me really what my preference would be in the mediation.
No, what I mean by that, John, is some people actually are genuinely opposed to private sessions. You know, I mean, they don't. It's not that they. I know we use them when appropriate, but some people just don't do private sessions. They say, no, I keep the parties in a joint session. That's what mediation is about. They must stay in a joint session. I'm talking about that kind of preference. All right,
Patrick, just on that and what John said there, I would feel deeply uncomfortable if I wasn't able to take parties into private sessions, because notwithstanding the fact that we are mediators and that we are not there to advise, we often can see what significant difficulties for one or other party, sometimes both, and it's not appropriate to discuss those difficulties, in my view, in a joint session. That would really breach that party's right to have a private conversation about their risk, and I personally would feel very uncomfortable with being forced into a situation where I could only conduct a mediation in a joint session. I often do, but I also need to know that I can use a private session.
Right. Everybody hear that? Paul says he'd feel uncomfortable if you couldn't put parties into private sessions. All right. In what circumstances would you have a private session? Let's not spend too much time on this. Can we quickly run through the groups here? Group one, when would you have a private session? Just a couple of instances when you would feel now we need a private session. I suppose there's an overlap with the pros of private sessions to a large extent, but just can we have a couple of any ideas? Group two, anybody from you? Any lot of emotion in the room?
I think it's an essential time when you have your reality checking.
Reality checking.
Absolutely essential for that.
Right. Group three, anybody, any additional? Reality checking, I suppose, in a sense. Group one on Zoom, any further circumstances when you would have a private session?
I think we didn't really get that far, but Francis was pointing out that sometimes things can get a bit heated and fractious, and that's obviously a good time to try and take heat out of the situation if you need to, by breaking people up.
Right. And group two, anything additional that you want to add? Right, there's a shaking of heads. Excellent. And the best time for a private session? Are there any times better than others in the mediation for a private session? Pre-mediation, private sessions. Group two. Sorry, Charlie.
You said when offers start being traded.
When offers start being traded,
The money.
good time for a private session, when the money comes into it. Excellent, thank you. Group 2, anything in addition? Any sort of particularly good time for a private session? I mean, I know you'll do it when you think you need to, but any particular times that when things are going around in circles and not moving on, breaking the impasse, really, isn't it? I suppose.
I think Charlie's point is absolutely right. When you started the parameters of a deal from £100 to 1,000, you've got to go to and fro of that session at that stage.
When did everybody hear that on Zoom? When you get to an offer and a counter offer, and you've got parameters within which to work, good time to go to private sessions to get the parties to talk about those figures. Group 3, anything you want to add? No. Group 1 on Zoom, anything additional?
Yeah, it's very important to tell parties that they can ask for a private session when they want one.
Tell parties that they can ask for a private session when they want one. Do that at the pre-mediation or at the start of the mediation. Anything from group 2? Nothing additional. Excellent. Okay, well, let's move on. I'm going to go to the next slide. These are just some thoughts that I have. Now, of course, I mean, one can't sit and define when you're going to have a private session, but the best time, from what I've picked up in my own practice and from reading about it, is for those who believe in pre-mediation meetings, and I know not everybody does, but they obviously are essentially a private session prior to the main joint session of the mediation. And in the mediation itself, in the actual mediation session, I think my preference is to start with a joint session and then let the parties have private sessions. Again, there's no rule of thumb. You might keep parties in a joint session for longer if there's a discussion that's toing and froing, but I think it's good for people to be able to state their positions and listen to each other before they actually go into private sessions and you start doing the work that gets done in those private sessions. The next point we just need to briefly look at is what should you as the mediator do if you are going to use private sessions, or you think you may use private sessions in the mediation. Somebody mentioned this earlier. It's a good idea to raise that in the introduction, either at a pre-mediation meeting or in the introduction to the mediation. And I think it's very important, because if you don't, and you end up with a joint session and you feel as the mediator, it's time now to put the parties into breakout rooms. It's time to separate these people. Either it's becoming emotional or argumentative, or there's something that you want to discuss with one of the parties, and you suddenly say to the parties, I'm going to now put you into breakout rooms. We're now going to go into private sessions. I think that's going to create a lot of doubt and insecurity amongst the parties, because what have I said? What has happened? Why are we now going into private sessions? Nobody told us this is going to happen. So I think it's vitally important to mention private sessions as part of the process at the first opportunity. And as Paul mentioned on Zoom, it's important to explain to the parties that they can also ask for a private session. If one of them feels they want to have a discussion with you, it's not just up to you to say, I think we're now going to have private sessions. If somebody wants to have a private session, and they may want to, there may have been something said by the other party that they want to raise with you. There may be a reason why they want to have this private session. They must feel free to say, can we have a private session? They don't want to ask in front of the other party. They've got the chat box to send you a message and say, can we please have a private session? Important when you're dealing with confidentiality of the entire mediation, to stress the confidentiality in private sessions. And I think it's a good idea when you have the private sessions to again reiterate that, because you want parties to open up in a private session. There's no point in having the private session. Well, there may be other reasons for having it, but if you want to have a frank discussion with a party, if they fear that what they're saying to you is not confidential, it may somewhat defeat the object of having that meeting. Who can ask for a private session? Well, we've covered that. It can be at the instance of the mediator or any one of the parties. And time management, and this touches on what Charlie said earlier about parties being left on their own. There are a couple of things that come into play here. The one is that I think it is good to manage the time and to try and have equal time with the parties in private sessions. However, I think we all know that it's not always, whilst that's the ideal, it's not always possible. Sometimes you just need to spend more time with a party for various reasons. There might be a difficult aspect that's got to be canvassed, and you just need time. Otherwise, you're not going to make progress in the mediation. One of the ways that you could deal with that is just to excuse yourself briefly from the private session, go to the other room, whether it be physical or a breakout room, and advise the other party that, you know, you are still busy, things are progressing quite well, and you just need more time with the first party. So I think it's important to manage that time. I don't think it's always, you'll read in the literature that a lot of people say you should really try and spend equal time with the parties. It's not always necessary. And I mean, sometimes you may spend 20 minutes with one party and 3 minutes with the other, because you needed to do work in the one private session and not in the other. So it's not always easy to spend equal time, because you might just be wasting your time. If you feel that it's a major issue, if you feel that you don't want to create the impression with for example, the party with whom you spent a lot of time, you could maybe just leave the second private session and take a short break. But I don't think that is the most important consideration, spending equal time in the breakout rooms. I think it's more important to make sure that one party doesn't get left behind in a private session without knowing what's going on. And I'll confess this, I did have a situation last week, in fact, where a very difficult claimant who was represented by solicitors in court, but they weren't at the mediation. He had very little knowledge of what was happening in court. He's 96 years of age and was a very, very, very difficult party to deal with. And I needed an enormous amount of time with him in a breakout room. We had a whole lot of things to discuss and deal with. And I got so, it was so difficult that I unfortunately neglected to go and inform the other party that I was taking so long with the claimant. And I eventually got an email from the respondent saying, are we still in this meeting? So I immediately went and told him what was happening. But, you know, I think you should avoid that. It didn't do any damage, fortunately, but I think you should avoid that kind of situation. You should manage the time by at least informing the other party of what's going on. If you can use an assistant, if you have an assistant mediator with you, you can use that as well to inform the other party of what was going on. I think in this case we were both so caught up with dealing with the claimant that it's just the time just passed, and it was really we got there, but it was very, very difficult along the way.
I had a similar experience in the past where we ended up far too long. The other party was left for far too long in the room. I have taken to saying before we go into the private sessions, I will be no more than, say, 10 minutes. And if it's looking at it, put a timer on, and if it's looking as though it's going to be more than that, physically come out and go and say what's happening. Yeah. For exactly that reason, because as Charlie said, people don't like being left alone. It can be really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't know if, did everybody hear that? Gordon said he likes to tell parties how long he's going to be in a breakout room. The other thing you can do, which I think to some extent answers Charlie's concern about parties not wanting to be left on their own, I invariably tell parties when I'm going to the one breakout room, I tell them in the other breakout room there's going to be a break, go and have a cup of tea or coffee, take a walk outside, do whatever you need to do. I'm going to be at least 10 or 15 minutes. So I give them the opportunity of actually filling that time in, not just waiting for somebody to come back. So that's another way of kind of just filling in the gaps so that they don't sit there worrying about what's happening. All right, we move on. These are some of the advantages that I've identified with private sessions, and most of them I think were covered, if not all of them were covered by the various groups today. You can have a frank discussion with the party, and that frank discussion can become frank two ways. You can raise things with the party that you simply can't raise in a joint session, and the party can raise things with you. The party can tell you things and say, look, I'm telling you this confidentially, but this is what's happened here, and so on and so forth. And you can have that frank discussion, which can't take place anywhere else. it was raised today, you could deal with emotions. When things become emotional, either one party becomes tearful or angry or aggressive or abusive. When those emotions start coming out, it's a good way of diffusing the situation by saying, look, I think it's now time to go into breakout rooms. And comparing now, I know that we're mostly mediating on Zoom still, but we probably will start doing face-to-face mediation soon. I will say with private sessions and Zoom, I think it's a lot easier to put people into private sessions and breakout rooms on Zoom than what it is physically in a face-to-face mediation, because physically, particularly depending on the reason for the private sessions, but when things become a bit emotional and a bit abusive and a bit aggressive, it's not always easy to physically get a party out of the room if you're doing a face-to-face mediation, whereas on Zoom, you can actually kind of just come in and say, look, I think it's time for a bit of time out, let's go into breakout rooms. And if you move quickly enough before the parties actually realize that they're in a breakout room, and you diffuse the situation that way. So that's a useful reason for using breakout rooms.
Yes. Years ago from a friend who works in a school for children with behavioral difficulties. Very, very simple. Always leave the angry person in the room. So and you would know this, Gordon, as a teacher. So you take the camera of the two, you say, right, you stand up and you walk out, and it's much simpler. And people's anger can't really do a lot. The worst they can do is damage the furniture.
if you, I don't know if you heard that on Zoom. Charlie says, take the calm person out of the room, leave the angry person behind. That's a way of dealing with an emotional situation. Reality testing. My principle is I don't do reality testing in a joint session. I was actually thinking about it on the way here today. I was wondering whether there is scope for any reality testing in a joint session. There probably is, but I think it's a lot safer to do it in private sessions, particularly when you're discussing the sort of merits and demerits of a case with a party. I mean, you shouldn't be doing that in front of another party. There could be, I suppose, general reality testing when you say to the parties, if the reality testing applies to both of them, and if you're kind of saying, look, if this matter goes to court, you're both going to spend a lot of time at court, you're both going to possibly incur expenses, etc., etc. That kind of general reality testing that applies to both parties could conceivably be done in a joint session, but any reality testing that applies to only one of the parties, I mean, it goes without saying, you must do that in a private session without seriously prejudicing that party's case. Option generation, the same principle. If you're going to help the party in trying to develop options, trying to look at ways of resolving this, private sessions are the way to do that. Breaking an impasse, that was mentioned earlier. If you're trying to break an impasse, a private session is the way to go. And I suppose coupled to that is avoiding a breakdown of the process. If you really have a situation where things have come to a head and you're not making progress, really similar to breaking the impasse, it's one way of trying to further the mediation without the whole thing coming to an end. And of course, if one of the parties said to you that they want to terminate the mediation, you could immediately take them into a private session and discuss with them why they want to do that. So those are the advantages which I think are very useful. And as Alistair said earlier, I mean, I think private sessions are an important part of the mediation process. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages. These are disadvantages. They're not necessarily disadvantages that I identify as being disadvantages. These are disadvantages that I've identified from the literature. And let's work through them and let's see whether they are in fact disadvantages. The first, according to some of the articles that I've read, is that the mediator controls the flow of information. Now this is described in an article that I read as a disadvantage of private sessions. Now I'm not sure that that's correct. I'm not sure that controlling the flow of information is necessarily a disadvantage. And I'm going to end off today by referring you to a very, very interesting article by Susan Silby and Sally Merry, which dates back to 1986, where they focus on the process that they recommend, and that is where the mediator actually, they describe the mediator as manipulating the mediation. So So controlling the flow of information, and again, we're talking about quarter next mediation. We're not talking about relationships. We're not talking about family matters. We're not talking about community mediation, although some of that may overlap into civil procedure, but we're really talking about, in the main, money. We're talking about financial disputes. And I'm not sure that controlling the flow of information is not in some ways very helpful to getting to a settlement, because you're able to let the good information be shared and exclude some of the bad information, and that does often lead to promoting a settlement. The manipulation of the mediator. Now, we spoke about the article by Sylvie and Mary about the mediator being the manipulator, but this is the manipulation of the mediator. Again, I think it depends on the mediator. I don't know that any competent, experienced mediator would allow themselves to be manipulated by the parties, either in a joint session or in a private session. I think it's up to the mediator to not let yourself be manipulated. Don't be the bearer of bad news. If a party says to you, if they want to make a ridiculous offer to the other party in such a way that you know it's going to be seen as an insult, don't take it across, don't share it. Nothing stops you saying to the respondent who makes that insulting offer, because it would be designed to do that. There's a claim of, say, £3,000, and there's an offer of £10. It's a ridiculously low, stupid offer designed to actually just anger the claimant. And the respondent says, "No, I want you to make that offer." Say, "No, I'll put you back in a joint session. You make the offer, because I'm not going to convey that. It's a ridiculous offer. I'm going to convey that to the claimant. It's just going to cause more dispute and more emotion. So if you want to do that, we can go into a joint session and you can convey the offer." So I don't think that if the mediator is careful that there is going to be manipulation. Loss of neutrality, same thing applies. There's only going to be a loss of neutrality if the mediator is going to allow him or herself to lose neutrality. If you make sure that neutrality is maintained, obviously, I think what you've got to be careful of is that there's a perception of a loss of neutrality. I don't think that, again, a good mediator is going to lose that neutrality, but you must make sure that one of the parties doesn't believe that you are losing neutrality. And the way of doing that is simply to make sure that you have frank discussions with each party, and you make sure that you don't say anything that indicates that you may be favoring the one side above the other. The inaccurate conveying of information, it is a risk. It is a risk, but again, it depends on how much information you're going to convey. As a general rule, I don't like to convey much information between private sessions. I like to convey offers, amounts of offers, and basic information that I check very carefully with the party who wants me to share that information. But I try and avoid conveying contextual information, conveying information that relates to something that has to be understood in a certain way by the other party. What I say to the parties then is, I'm going to put you back in a joint session. You can convey that much better to the other party than what I can. And something might get lost in me conveying that information. So let's go back into a joint session and you convey the information. So I try and make sure that the bare minimum information is conveyed, and it's mostly offers and counter offers, with perhaps a few other things thrown in, but again, very carefully noted, very carefully checked with the party before I share that information. Because, and we get on to the second last disadvantage, because I don't want to violate confidentiality. And the more you share, the more information you share between the parties, the more risk you have of violating confidentiality, because you may forget exactly what you've been told that you're allowed to share with the other party and what you're not allowed to share. So the way that you can limit that violation of confidentiality is simply limit the information, write it down in point form, check it with the party, and only share that information. And the last disadvantage that is identified is that shuttled offers, rather than an exchange of views. In other words, you're going to end up in a situation where the parties are not really getting to deal with underlying issues or with relationship issues, etc. but it's just going to be a negotiation process that takes place. Now, again, we're talking about court annexed mediation. We're talking about claims. We're talking about money. In the main, there are other claims as well that come out of the simple procedure courts, but these are the main claims that we are dealing with. And excuse me, and at the end of the day, we really want to get down to that negotiation process. So I'm not sure that the identified disadvantages are necessarily disadvantages, but I do think that they are things that we should all bear in mind when we are taking part in private sessions. They are things that we must try and avoid, and we must avoid falling into the traps of being guilty of these particular things. And we're getting close to the end now. This is just a short note on private sessions and shuttle mediation. Now, I'm not really, well, I don't think shuttle mediation, when it comes to pure shuttle mediation, when you only shuttle, I don't really believe in that in the context of the clinic at all, because I think it's just, we know from experience in the clinic, the success rate is very low, the matters don't settle, and it's parties who really don't want to get to grips with what they need to discuss. And as I say, it's something I think to be avoided. But you can end up in a situation, if you're going into private sessions, if you have your pre-mediation meetings, you have your opening joint session, and you start private sessions, you can end up in a situation where it develops into a shuttle mediation. Now, I don't think it's necessarily the best way of conducting a mediation, but again, in the context of the matters that we're dealing with, if it's working, let it work. If sometimes after private sessions, you may find that parties have a slight reluctance to go back into a joint session. Things were said in the initial opening session, and there's this kind of sensitivity that develops, and they say to you, if the respondent says, I want to offer the claimant £1,000, I would invariably say, well, should we go back into a joint session and you convey your offer? Almost 100% of the time, the respondent will say, no, I'd prefer it if you conveyed the offer. So there is that reluctance, and that can kind of be construed as a shuttle mediation as it develops. But if it's going to bring about a settlement at that stage, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. Shuttle mediation, as we know by definition, is where the mediator acts as the messenger, and you're just toing and froing and toing and froing. And then you end up with those disadvantages that we looked at earlier. You end up with, if you're just going to shuttle, if you're just going to jump backwards and forwards and convey information, you end up with all of the issues of possibly breaching confidentiality and not conveying the context in which things are said, and so on and so forth. So that is where shuttle mediation can be a negative, whereas just having private sessions, and maybe even more than one private session, but always having the option of coming back into joint session and bringing the mediation back into that format is a good thing. And I've discussed the last point earlier. Private sessions, of course, can develop into a shuttle in certain circumstances. And these are just a couple of references that I looked at for the content of today's presentation. Very interesting article, excuse me, in mediate.com, Caucus and Aid in Mediation. Caucus, of course, being the American term for private sessions. It's a fairly recent article written in 2018. And the second one was the case for private caucus written in 2017 by Brian R. Jerome in the Massachusetts Dispute Resolution Services. So those are two articles that you could look at if you want to know a little bit more about that. Just to go back to the previous article, I'm not going to call it back on the screen, but there's a quote that I just wanted to read to you. Now, having discussed what we have this afternoon about private sessions, and I think it's probably fair to say that there's a tendency towards using private sessions. People, I think everybody present is in favor of that tool in a mediation. But then it also raises some interesting points, and I'm only going to touch very briefly on two of them. The one is a quote from Stephen Lee in Caucus and Aid in Mediation, and the second is a mediation that I did very recently. Firstly, Stephen Lee's quote from an aid in mediation. He says, some mediators will call a caucus at the first sign of dispute or negative emotionally between the parties. This may be unwarranted as the parties are in dispute and the need to voice their concerns under the protection of confidentiality within the mediation room allows for the parties to tell their story. Also, the mediator can gain valuable information from the manner in which the parties interact while in distress. It is hoped that while hearing what is said and observing this type of interaction between them, the mediator can gain insight into facilitating a decision leading to an agreement or settlement that benefits both parties. So there's a kind of a warning saying don't be overly keen to jump into a private session. There's also a lot to be gained from a joint session. So that's something we need to bear in mind. Is just be sensitive to that. Don't just use a private session as a way of kind of, advancing matters. If you may be feeling a bit insecure as a mediator with the joint session, don't just go into private sessions because it seems like the easier option. And on that note, I'm going to share with you something that I experienced a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to just read you a brief note from our reflection in that matter. Both parties stated their positions very succinctly. A dialogue then started between them. It became a bit heated at times, but not that I felt that intervention was necessary. They occasionally interrupted each other, but again, not to the extent that I felt that intervention was necessary. This was a prime example of the importance of silence from the mediators. The parties needed space and we gave it to them. Their conversation went on for some considerable time, but it was apparent that the tone of the discussion was changing. They actually started feeling empathy towards each other, something that one doesn't always experience in a mediation. They'd also stopped interrupting each other and were engaging with what the other was saying. It was quite a special experience to see this reconciliation unfolding in front of us. Now, that was my note from the reflection. And just to give it a little bit of context, it was a situation, it was a workplace mediation. It was a simple procedure case, but it involved the workplace. It involved a fellow that had resigned his employment without giving the requisite notice. And he was being sued for basically compensation for not giving the month's notice that he was required to give. And he was also being sued for training costs. He'd undergone training, and in terms of his employment contract, if he resigned within less than 2 years, he had to refund a portion of the training costs. So that was the claim. The parties came into the mediation. The respondent, in fact, didn't want to mediate. The respondent was very anti-mediation. He said he's not mediating. It's not going to get anywhere. The matter's not going to settle. He doesn't trust the employer, and this is going nowhere. I managed to persuade him to mediate, and he came into the mediation, as I say, a very reluctant party. And there were two people representing the employer, the claimant, and they were very adamant about their case. They were also, it was a very kind of emotional and tense mediation. These parties were really wanting to have a go at each other. And we had the joint session. And at the end of the joint session, they were good in the joint session. The respondent kept quiet while the claimant was putting their case, and then he replied, and the claimant kept quiet. And then we got into a point where they started having a toing and a froing, a discussion going on between them, but they were actually interrupting each other. And it was a little bit heated. And my kind of first inclination, my gut feel was, maybe it's time to go into breakout rooms. Maybe this is time to separate the parties before things go bad. And yet, I'm not quite sure why, but I kind of felt maybe just give it another couple of minutes. Just let's see where this goes. And it was absolutely amazing how it then unfolded, because the parties started interrupting each other less and listening to each other more. And they ended up having an amazing discussion. And information came out on both sides that the other was not aware of. And it was almost a bit disconcerting, because we as mediator, an assistant mediator with me, we were sitting there, and we all know that feeling where you kind of feel, you know, you're the mediator, you need to be doing something, you need to be summarizing, rephrasing, really doing something, but there was nothing to do. These parties were having a conversation. We were access to this discussion. We were just watching, we were observers, and they had this amazing discussion, and they got an amazing settlement. And they both apologized to each other at the end. Now, I mention this because we could have destroyed a lot of that if we'd gone into private sessions too early. So as much as I'm in favor of private sessions, we've got to have that sensitivity to, you know, that fine line between, is the private session going to help here, or should we just carry on with what the parties are saying? So that, I think, is an important lesson. And then I did mention, and I think we probably, I don't know how we are for time, Charlie, are we're probably a bit over time or close. I'm just going to mention, if you want to look at, and we can maybe send the reference out, there's a good article by Sylvie and Mary on mediator settlement strategies, where they talk about, at one point, the role of the mediator as a manipulator in actually bringing about the settlements. So, do we have time for any questions? If there are questions, can we ask if there are any? I know any questions from Zoom? Any questions online? Nothing there. Any questions here? Anybody got anything to say? Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me.